We're here at the many harbors of Pu'uloa, and that's one of the original names of this place that is now most people know as Pearl Harbor. This was once the food basket for Oahu Island, and Oahu was relatively peaceful because it had abundance of fresh water and resources like this. So where the fresh water mixes with salt water, you have an estuary and the nursery for the small fish, the shellfish, and everything. And the Hawaiians had a very extensive and sophisticated aquaculture system, fish ponds. Used the natural flow of tide and fresh water to raise these fish. So low input of labor and resources, high output of protein. So Oahu was relatively momona fat because of that. And in 1873, you had General John Schofield and General Burton Alexander came to Hawaii on a tourist expedition. But they were secretly spying on Hawaii for the U.S. military. So in their communiques back to Washington, they said that Pearl Lagoon is the key to the Central Pacific Ocean. So already they were making their plans. And you got to understand at that time too, Admiral Mahan had just come out with his sort of theories about naval sea power and how the great empires all had these powerful navies. And so they were, looking out in the Pacific and going, okay, if we want to get to China and all of the riches there, if we want to get in on the imperial game and compete with the Europeans, we need a stepping stone in the Pacific. So Hawaii became the key to that plan. It's amazing how our small islands have been the pivoting points for these great events of history and the building of these powerful empires. The Hawaiian sugar growers, who were mostly haole businessmen, the white businessmen, they wanted to sell sugar to the U.S., but the tariffs were too high, and the U.S. wanted access to this resource. So they made a free trade agreement. They called it a Treaty of Reciprocity. The U.S. gets access to Pearl Harbor. Hawaii gets to sell its sugar to the United States. And that was very unpopular with the Hawaiian people, who lived and used these resources.
And to the monarchy.
And to the monarchy, but the king signed it eventually, and so it destabilized his government. There was a lot of protests and a lot of opposition. So 10 years later, when the time for renewal of the treaty came about, the sugar growers were afraid that they weren't going to get the treaty renewed because of all the controversy. And instead, in order to cinch the deal, they staged a coup d'etat. They basically brought out weapons, threatened the king with overthrow if he didn't sign a new constitution. They call it we call it the Bayonet Constitution, and that in one fell swoop it disenfranchised the majority of the Hawaiian population. So if you're Native Hawaiian, you didn't own enough property, you didn't have enough cash in the bank, you couldn't vote. If you were of Asian descent in the islands, and at that point the sugar plantations were bringing in Japanese, Filipinos, right? You couldn't naturalize, so you couldn't have any political power. But if you're white and you own land and property and had wealth, you could vote. So that flipped the balance of power radically, and that sets up the overthrow a few years later, because the Queen was trying to restore what was lost in that Constitution in 1893, and then the U.S. Marines, landed in Honolulu Harbor, marched up on Iolani Palace, and their guns were, they had their Gatling guns armed and pointing at the palace. And that's the muscle that enabled this small group of white businessmen to overthrow the Queen. So our broken relationship between Hawaii and the United States, and especially its military, begins with this breach of friendship and trust and treaties. There were international treaties that Hawaii had that made it a neutral place. You couldn't come here and wage war. You had to.
We got to continue that neutral place.
Yes.
I think so. I think that's really
not just Hawaii, the entire Pacific.
Yeah.